Hello, everyone, and perhaps hello again for some of you. I'm Martin Spring, and I'm the Vice President for Conferences for IFSAM, and I've also got the honour of chairing this IFSAM award session with a focus on society-relevant management scholarship. I should also say that here in Lancaster in England, we have a thunderstorm at the moment, so you may have some unusual sound effects in this session as well. The award winner, I'll get to the point immediately, is Romain Laufer, and it's an amazing body of work that's being recognized here. I'm sure Romain will tell us lots more about it, but briefly, it's a body of work over decades, I would say, that touches on a wide range of topics covering matters such as risk, management involvement in public debate, and matters of legitimacy of management, and I think rooted in both sociology and management expertise. I wonder if excessively focused young scholars today could range quite so widely and in such an interesting way, but that's a debate for another day. So one more thing to do before I hand over to Romain is to point out that we have another round of awards, and there they are. There are the details for Societally Relevant Management Scholarship and Indigenous Management Scholarship. There's a deadline coming up soon, the 15th of September. So please consider applying, nominating colleagues, and forward the information to anyone who may be interested. That's all from me. I'll hand over now to Romain. I will stop sharing. Over to you.
I don't know what's happening here. No, that's it.
Yep.
Okay. And that's okay. Well, so I start.
Yes, please.
Well, first, of course, I would like to thank IFSAM for the honor of presenting me with the inaugural award for excellence in societally relevant management scholarship. Having to give an account of my research journey, I first had to realize that this journey began more than 50 years ago. Yes, more than half a century, when in 1968, the French government decided to propose to a group of graduates from French business schools to go to some of the best American business schools to engage in a technology transfer process relative to the methods of teaching and research in management. There are two dimensions to such a process: imitation and transposition. Because of the attachment to the French cultural tradition I had acquired during my studies, I was constantly confronted with the need to account both for the reasons for such an import and for the transformation involved in its acclimatization to its new homeland. Understanding the cultural, institutional, anthropological difference between France and the United States became a central underlying focus of my research. The first article resulting explicitly from this confrontation between French institutions dominated by the public sector and the institutions of the United States dominated by the private sector was entitled Crise de légitimité dans les grandes organisations, and crisis of legitimacy in large organizations. The part of the article devoted to the United States having been written at the very beginning of the 70s, I could not have known of the very first article dealing with the new institutionalism in organizational analysis. Back in France, developing my research in parallel to this important trend led me on a track which, comparison with the one developed in the States, may be considered as an expression of the cultural institutional difference involved. The most obvious difference lies in the very presence of the notion of crisis in my first article and its absence from the index of Powell DiMaggio opus. The only exception being to some extent by Friedland and Alford, which deals with institutional contradictions in chapter 10, entitled Bringing Back Society In. These being linked to their reference to Teda Skocpol, co-editor of Bringing Back the State In, and to European anthropologists, reference to European anthropologists like Marcel Mauss, or from Marcel Mauss to Marie Douglas. All my research since then has centered around better understanding of the notion of crisis and its consequences for the development of management. However, I must note that my work has included from the start two important American references. One in economics, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit by Frank Knight, University of Chicago Press, 71, actually published by O'Flynn in 21. One in the field of law, Thurman Arnold, The Folklore of Capitalism, Yale University Press, 1938. Both authors were dealing directly with the notion of crisis of legitimacy through the notion of uncertainty for the first one and crisis of the antitrust laws for the second one. Neither author are quoted, as far as I know, in the new institutionalist literature, at least until the year 2000. Since then, my research has been devoted to the development of an institutional approach to management based on the notion of system of legitimacy, the aim of which is to articulate in a rigorous manner, if possible, marketing, management, law, social sciences, and philosophy. The approach is grounded on Max Weber's definition of rational legal type of legitimate authority. By definition, rational legal legitimacy is founded on philosophy, which is supposed to tell us all about reason, law, and social sciences, which are the sources of whatever legality lies in the system. A crisis of legitimacy happens when social relations transgress the limits determined by the system of legitimacy. With time, I've been confronted to such transgressions concerning the limits between the public and the private sector, concerning the limit between philosophy and sophism, between products and services, between risk and uncertainty, between conventions and institutions. Each time, the same sequence of events developed. The transgression of the limit raised protests. This, in turn, implied the development of a theory to account for the necessity of such a transgression, and also to account for the way in which this implied a transformation of management. The reception of such a theory had to be ambivalent, an ambivalence which expresses itself in various modes of denegation. The fact that the notion of crisis in its full meaning is difficult to acknowledge is shown by its quasi-absence in the new institutionalist literature. This is particularly true of the American literature, as is shown by the way in which the notion of crisis is absent from the writings of the decision school of management, the famous Carnegie School, in spite of the fact that the etymological origin of crisis is the Greek krinein, to decide, and krisis, decision. They don't refer to the notion of crisis even when describing the famous garbage can model. The reception, the reception, when comparing both culture, I would say that the reception of the adjective societal in the two cultures, French and Anglo-Saxon, gives us the opportunity to try to understand both what they have in common and how they differ. Indeed, the adjective societal appears in both cultures at the same time, at the beginning of the 70s, which is also the moment of the emergence of what is known as new institutionalism. It is met in some quarters of the French academic world with strong resistance. For instance, Philippe Diribarne, the author of The Logic of Honor, attacked the way in which Maurice Sellier and Sylvestre use the adjective societal to characterize a comparative analysis of the French and German national systems of production, instead of referring to the notion of national culture. To this attack, they responded in the following way. Thus, the search for the societal effect took place in the mid-70s, at a time when people began to question the nature of a crisis that highlighted both the internationalization of the economy and the strengths and weaknesses of each society in face of renewed competitiveness. This debate is then directed toward questioning the paradigm of industrial society and the model of organization and management and of social relationships which develops within it. This is the Revue Française de Sociologie in '92. Another very violent attitude toward violent expression against societal is by François Héran, who is not a nobody. He's a professor of Collège de France, and he wrote in the Revue Française de Sociologie, getting rid of societal. So you see, the attitude in France was not very favorable. It should come as no surprise that a clear definition of the difference between social and societal would emerge in America in the context of the crisis of the 30s. In a discussion of an article where the great American sociologist Sorokin answered negatively to the question, is accurate social planning possible? That was the title of his article. And his answer was no. And it was in the American Sociological Review, I think the first volume of this review. There was a comment of this article, and this, which is very interesting. Another distinction, he says, another distinction which Professor Sorokin fails to make clear is that between social planning and societal planning. Here again, it seems to me that there can be no reasonable disagreement as to the possibility of social planning. And then he says, if we turn to societal planning, of course, the problem becomes much more difficult. Here we are dealing with not with localized groups or limited special interests, but with the whole structure and functioning of the community itself. To expect even approximate perfection would, of course, be absurd. So you see, that is it's written behind, and whether you can see it, it's written the question of the limit of the system we consider. So what the difference between social and societal is precisely the fact that the limits of what would be a society are blurred, and the societal is blurred between the individual, the group, and society, and there are interactions which transform them in a kind of permanent feedback. By the way, the notion, first translation in English came from a translation from Georg Simmel's work, who is very much in this type of interaction, looking at this type of interaction. Then you have the denegation in the very article. But we need not be deterred by the probability of minor failures. And we should not be dismayed by if the practical results fall considerably short of our wishes or our anticipation. So you see precisely there both the threat, the transgression, and the denegation. And all the time you have the same thing. Now, if you, it happens that when you look on the internet, to Collins, the word societal, you see the history of the use of this term, and very clearly it starts really in the 70s. And of course, a little bit in 40, you see 30X would be the Sorokin article, and then it goes right away like that. And interestingly enough, it's very similar to the curve of management. With the difference, of course, is management does exist before 48, but there is a shift which make us think that the very meaning of management is changing at that time. So the question is, would be eventually to interpret these curves. Management, by the way, in France, has been received with as much negativity as societal, not by everybody, but by academics of a certain type. Pierre Legendre, in Dominus Mundi, L'Empire du Management, wrote, management is a word without a homeland. That means whatever you want it to mean. Globalized management comes up against this huge, unacknowledged, and unmanageable question. Can we buy tradition, religions, or the mind of the people and convert them into a market object? This raises two questions. Why the emergence of the adjective societal is experienced as the expression of a crisis in France and not in the USA or in Great Britain. And the second question is, how can we account for the similitude and the differences in the reception of societal, and for that matter of management, between France on one side and USA on the other side, on the other. I'll try to do it rapidly. The kernel of the French, and I take it from the French system, which is easier to describe in many ways. The kernel of the French system is the legal system. We have private and public sector are separated, and they refer to different hierarchy of legal institutions. The public sector going to the State Council, and the private sector going up to the Cour de Cassation. The limit, and that notion of limit, we know, is central to all what we say, is the criterion of administrative law. It happens that in France, this, of course, is the history is told in all the books, legal books. So it's we just have to read. From in the 19th century, it's a public power criterion corresponding to the garrison state. The legitimacy lies in the origin of power, according to status. Then you have, in the second period, public service criterion, which corresponds to the welfare state. It is the finality of power, which now is the source of legitimacy, or the criterion of legitimacy. And from 45 to 60, it is a crisis of the criterion, which I could interpret right away as a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of nation states. Well, that's why I could write the article, Crisis of Legitimacy in Large Organizations. And now the limit is defined by the methods of power. If we want to go a bit further, if we define an action as a change in appearances, in as much as it is referred to a cause, it's a phenomenological definition of action, we see that there are only three ways to legitimize such an action. The first one is the cause is legitimate, the origin of power. The second one is when the cause cannot anymore be considered clearly defined, we can legitimize by the change in appearances. And there are two cases. One case in which there is a consensus of measurement. And then, of course, finality of power becomes a source of legitimacy. And the second case is when there is no more consensus on measurement. And the legitimacy has to rely on the acceptability of the method of measurement itself. Now, we see the two last periods rapidly correspond to the positivist epistemology and non-positivist. And the breakdown is between 45, 60, let's say 65. On one side, we have closed system, which are limits, a priori limits. Then we have open system, no a priori limits. Determinist model, non-determinist. Consensus of measurement, no consensus of measurement. Belief in progress, no belief in progress. One best way, unexpected consequences, perverse effect, maximization, satisfaction, and the authors, Auguste Comte, Taylor, Chester Barnard, Simon. And here we have a difference between social and societal, I think. And that's why the world societal and the management which goes with it develops at that time. Now, to see the concrete effect of this, we can look at the names of schools. They go from the School of Business and School of Commerce to School of Management. And actually, it really starts in 68. You see, before 54, there is no School of Management. The first one is Rochester, the second one, Rutgers, the third one, MIT. And then starting around 68, there is an increasing number of School of Management. In 2020, when I looked at it, there was roughly 1/3 of the top 100 best, top 100 business school ranked in the US News and Report. A third of them were called management. And of course, before management existed, but it existed within the school as a title of the course, subordinated to the notion of business. So the legitimacy of business determined the legitimacy of management, which was below, whereas now management appears at the level of the legitimation. Now, the second thing, and I want to finish with that, if it's possible, is to try to explain in a few words the difference of attitude toward the notion of crisis in France on one side and Great Britain and the United States on the other side, one may start by noting that while the origin of these three modern democracies may be traced to a revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 for Great Britain, the War of Independence, 1776 for the United States, and the so-called Grande Révolution in 1789, 1793 for France. These revolutions differ radically as to the way in which they dealt with each of the three types of legitimate authority defined by Max Weber: charismatic, traditional, and rational. The British Revolution got rid of charisma with Charles I, but kept tradition and reason. The American Revolution got rid of tradition when they parted from the British, but they kept charisma and reason. Then the French Revolution wanted to get rid both of charisma and of tradition, and kept only reason. That is why reason plays a double role, a role manifest, explicit, which is common to all the Western countries. They have the same history of legitimacy from this point of view, theory of the market and in a way, theory of science. And at the same time, there is an implicit level, which is accounted by tradition, by charisma, and by reason. And thus, when British and American societies are confronted with an explicit contradiction of rational norms, they can always rely on the idea that it can be overcome. For Great Britain, thanks to the resources that result from the respect of traditional rituals, and for the United States, thanks to the faith of the nation in its manifest destiny. In France, church and appeal is not possible from within the system of legitimacy itself. The notion of crisis can be acknowledged. I will just finish by showing you that it's possible to physically to show this phenomenon. In the 19th century, you know what is, these are bills, banknotes. The iconography of banknotes is there to communicate trust in the banknote. And you see that, you can see, I don't have time to develop that, the French one is, you know, a Greek type line, black, and so on. It corresponds to the philosophical view of Kant in a critique of judgment. So it's really philosophy which defines the iconography. The tradition here, as you can see, castle, armories, and in America, all the pictures nearly have somebody with its name, whereas in France, no banknotes with a name, and in England there is one in 1840, which is the date of the marriage of Victoria with Saxe-Coburg. So there was so you see, Kenneth Arrow in 674, same time, defined trust as an invisible institution. So in a way, you can see it is possible to make visible the invisible through this notion of iconography. Now, I just want to finish by, these are some of my works, you see, they communicate with each other. In Crisis of Legitimacy, and the last one is Crisis in Democracy. In this article, I quoted Knight. The last work with Jérôme Méric is about Knight, because there is a centenary of his book and people recognize that he is an important person, and so on. I mean, so I just want to finish by concluding remarks. First, the work was not done alone. I owe a lot to my co-authors, Alain Burlot, which you all know, Catherine Paradès, Armand Actuel, Jérôme Méric. It was strongly stimulated by the participation in numerous research collectives, in marketing, the IFSAM, in public management, PMP and IFSA, in society and organization, SNO, HEC Paris, in management, URAM, in social sciences, SASE, in economics, ENSO and IFEP, in technology, IFIP, in environment management in Europe, SAMS program, in philosophy, the College of Philosophy. That was the first thing. Second thing, it's usual and normally to say what are the limits of your research. Well, the limit, the major limit, it's limited to the Western system of legitimacy. And it's not because the Western system of legitimacy is necessarily the most important forever. There is a question today, linked probably with this crisis of legitimacy, but this limit is linked to the possibility of having a methodology which allows to be relatively precise. Otherwise, it's too complex, at least for me. For the future, just I plan to continue to develop developing a theory of institution and pursuing the development of what I like to call a theoretically grounded empirical research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A wonderful tour de force. At Lancaster, we're always keen to point out that we are Lancaster University Management School, not business school. And we're a 1960s university, or we were set up in the 1960s. So I think your graph tells me something new about my own employer and institution. We've got some time for questions. I'm going to look at the questions and answers section. We don't have any questions at the moment. Can I ask you really a point on almost the last point on your last slide about how you might go about, sorry, Xavier. Well, I was going to ask the same question, Xavier. I'll put it in Xavier's words. What do you mean by theoretically grounded empirical research? How does it differ from deductive H testing? And my question was going to be a little bit more descriptive, which is, could you tell us about how you envisage empirical, theoretically grounded empirical research in this field?
Well, in a way, it's this way of formulating things is directed to the fashion of having empirically grounded theory. You see, I think it's possible to reverse a little bit, not for everybody, but to have a reverse attitude, which is to start with theory, and then to base on this theory the empirical test. I think the history of iconography of banknotes, which I've done, and the comparative history is typical. I have a framework. This framework tells me what are the foundation of the legitimacy in the three countries. Then how the three times there will be a shift in 3 periods. And I can follow these 3 periods. And I have a perfect collection of data, which is, of course, institutional data. It doesn't work with everything. You have objects which are perfect for that. And I've done several. This one is an example. And I must say, when I compare with the many articles that deal with the history of iconography of banknotes, I think it's much safer, for instance, to realize you don't have to make a lot of computation to see that nearly all the American banknotes of the 19th century have a figure with somebody with a name, and none in the French, and one in England, and when there is a dynastic problem. Then you see that this charisma happened during the war, for instance, and of course, because then you need charisma. In France, you have one young banknote, which is Bayard, the Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche in 1914. And in England, you have George V, who appears in a column on thing. Then, when the war is finished, of course, you cannot get rid of George V. So what happens? So the test is to know: do you have George VI on the thing? No, you don't. You have to wait 1960 to have the Queen on the banknote. People don't realize that. At the same time, you see, and that's an example. Or they don't realize that the "In God We Trust" exists only after 1954-56, which is, of course, the crisis of the charisma, which is expressed by the fact that you need the charisma beyond the charisma. And also of the very interesting thing when you have "In God We Trust," which is, in principle, the church and the state must be, and the profane and the sacred have to be separated. When you put in God we trust on the banknote, you show symbolically the confusion between the sacred and the profane. And if you look at the history, for instance, in America, of the relationship between sacred and the profane, you see that there was, I have read, you have that on SSNR, there are two big books on the wall of separation between church and state, which was a big debate at the end of the 19th century. And this big debate ended up by this formula, which is the wall of separation, which did not exist before. It was a sentence from Jefferson, which was used at that time to settle a dispute about the role of religion. And that was a melting pot. So you have history between that you can follow very precisely. And so that's one example. But I think I've done the history of standards of measurement, for instance, the meter, the kilogram, and it worked, and the money, and the monetary one, which works very well. But so, and also, for instance, one thing I'm planning to do, I've nearly done. I think it's interesting to understand theory. At the end of the 19th century, all the Western countries had at least one author who was dealing with market mechanism and economics and marginalism and so on. You had Jevons, you had Menger, and you had Walras, and so on. And well, it's one hypothesis which is purely theoretical, but which can eventually help understand theory, and economic theory, is that the difference between these countries is related to the anthropological principle which characterizes each country. So France being Cartesian, you have a system of equation. That's Walras. The German have no quantitative thing because they are linked to the notion of history, which is a basis and history. So each have the principle. Jevons, you start with experience, and so I think it's a way of going into theories, seeing how they are done, understanding the development. For instance, Hayek. Hayek plays a very important role in the legitimation of free market. Hayek, and another thing, which is pragmatism. If you want, everybody's looking at pragmatism, and Dewey is the big fashion. If you look at Dewey himself, so an important thing is to see that all the pragmatists had religion as a basis, similar to what I've said. So the pragmatism of the American does not work without faith in religion. If you do not have it, it doesn't work. And by the way, Dewey himself, he published a book called Reconstruction in Philosophy. And he published it once, I think, in 26, and another time in 46, something like that. And in the introduction, he says, they asked me what I would change. And so I would change only one word. Instead of saying reconstruction in philosophy, I would say reconstruction of philosophy. Okay, so this, and of course, another thing is the relationship between conventionalism and institutionalism. Why, for instance, why something that neo-institutionalism don't discuss very much is what is the link with between old and new? Why is there this empty space in between? Does that mean it's not the same thing, or is there a relationship between them? So all these issues, which are important in terms of, I think, understanding what is institutionalism, what is conventionalism, does it solve the problem of legitimacy or not? That's one example of why theory in the way can be interesting. And then you can derive from that, in a way, what I've done with this word management and societal. It is empirical. If you start from the empirical, it's interesting, you can interpret. But if you have a theory, then you ground empirically your theory by this data. And I think it's not a bad way of doing it. I'm not saying it's absolute. You have to have taste for that. But I think I would be more, I personally am more interested in having a set of data which I can interpret, which you can interpret theoretically, rather than taking theory from a set of data. Which
yes,
is
but
for instance, I have one example. Yes, I have one. I'm sorry, I will let you
No, just to clarify, in contrast to Xavier's point about it's not simply theory testing,
no,
but using theory to
it
explore data
yes,
in particular ways.
or understanding things.
Yes.
For instance, I'll give you one example, which I think is very striking, even for teaching. The notion of service, the notion of service. I teach marketing services. People say services are not material. I say to my student, well, you go to the railway station, you look at the train, a TGV, and you say it 3 times, services are not material, services are not materials, and then you come back. But then you take a perfume, of course, this is product, this is material. I mean, so you see that empirical, we are ready to say absurdity from, and the question is, what are the theoretical reasons which explain this blindness? And I can explain it. And I can explain it by theory. And by the way, I wrote it in 86 or 7 in an article based on Frank Knight, because I showed that actually I showed you just had to take Frank Knight's definition of perfect competition, and he has 9 conditions plus 2. If you take the 9 conditions, you see that each time you relax a condition, you have a service category. So what is service? Is crisis, is simply the crisis of market mechanism. Once you understand that, you see that all services have to have regulations and so on. And you can see the history of each of them and understand better the history of each of them. And also the question of material. So you see this example, for instance, you can look at empirical. I must say, I had a very strange experience with that. A friend of mine was in the Ministry of Industry, and he told me one day, and it's a true story. He told me, please, we have money to finance research on services. Please do a submission. Disappear. Do a submission, submit something. I say, no, I will not submit because you will refuse me. Anyway, you will refuse me. I say, no. Okay, I propose something and he refuses. So I invite him to lunch so as to be able to tell him how displeased I was. I told him, if you had not asked me, I would not be, it was no problem. But you asked me, why didn't you accept? Because we didn't know what you were doing. I didn't say that I would interview 40 people on the street to ask them what is a service. I say that I would read 100 books of excellent authors to understand what is service. This is theoretically grounded empirical research.
Thank you. Wonderful. And I didn't know where today's conversation would go, but I'm pleasantly surprised that it converges and concludes on a subject I actually know about and have published about a bit, which is the difference between products and services, in particular drawing on Jean Gadret.
Yes, Jean Gadret was my corpus. I started by Gadret Delaunay book. Yes. They were the best. They were really the best. They were very good. However, because they say there was 2 things, which was one is salary and the other one was insurance. And that was very good. But if you go to Knight, then you go something more complete.
Thank you. We must draw it to a close there, although we could probably discuss this for hours. At this point, were we in a room together, this would be where we would hand over a certificate and shake hands and have a round of applause, but we'll consider that to be taking place now. I don't know if you want to comment, Xavier.
Thank you so much, Martin. Just to thank Romain for his presentation, and I'm sure that it will trigger more conversations. So congratulations, félicitations encore.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you everyone for attending. We'll draw the session to a close. Thank you once again, Romain, and everybody in the audience. Congratulations.